Jason, thank you so much. And I am so excited to be able to bookend this conference with an opportunity to help challenge and stretch your minds about where supply chain is going next. And I couldn't be more honored to share the stage with 4 luminaries with expertise in supply chain sustainability, financials, supply chain forecasting, planning, and AI/ML. So this should be a fantastic dialogue. So joining me on stage, I'd like to invite them to join me. Dr. Jan Godsell, from the Dean of the Economics and Business School at Loughborough University in Lancashire, UK. Her expertise focuses on the design of end-to-end supply chain to enable sustainability, resiliency, and productivity. Next, Dr. Nada Sanders, the Distinguished Professor of Supply Chain Management at the Business School at Northeastern University in Boston. Nada is a recognized expert in supply chain planning and forecasting, and the author of the book, The Hue Machine. Next, Professor Pascal von Hentenryck is a professor of industrial systems and engineering at the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta. Pascal is also the director for the National Science Foundation AI Institute for the Advances in Optimization. And last but not least, Professor Morgan Swink. He's the chair and professor of supply chain management at the Business School for Texas Christian University in Dallas. And he is the chair for the Center of Supply Chain Innovation and is an expert in supply chain excellence and the financial results. So with that, welcome to the stage, Morgan. Well, today's purpose is really to have a conversation about thriving through these times that some would say is the most difficult hour for supply chain. So thank you all so much for joining me today. I'd like to start off by just asking you, tell us a little bit more about yourselves and what do you think is one of the most critical issues or opportunities facing the supply chain right now? So Jen, let's start with you.
Hi. So my career has been split between industry and academia. I've worked for organizations such as AstraZeneca and Dyson when it was a scale-up, and it was at Dyson that I really realized that just making manufacturing more efficient was going to help them to make more money, that actually they needed to make sure that every vacuum cleaner they produced ended up with someone useful, and that they had the supply base to support it. So, you know, roll forward to COVID, and that's that same old balancing demand and supply issue. So I think some of the biggest issues that we face going forward are those challenges around how we work together to enable a net zero future.
Great, thank you, Jen. Nada.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for having me. My area is forecasting and really how humans work with AI technology. I've spent a long time doing that, and I think right now we're really at a crossroads. I think it's a window for all of us to take advantage in terms of poising ourselves to really move into the lead in terms of the corporate sector. I think finally everyone sees what we do, how important it is. And I say everyone meaning, you know, leaders at all levels. Even the layperson now knows that you don't just press a button and things show up. And I recall a few years back a CEO saying, they all still think that all we do is move boxes. Well, we don't just do that. I think this window is open for us. I don't think it's going to stay open forever. So I think it is really important that we all learn the language of finance, the language of the C-suite, and really grab the moment to really take our place in leading companies in every area.
Great, thanks, Nada. Pascal.
Yes, thank you, and very happy to be here. So I'm the engineer in this group, so I'm going to give you a more technology-based answer here about the opportunities. So I think we are at a very interesting time in supply chain, and I think there are essentially three really good drivers for innovation. And the first one is data. And essentially collecting a massive amount of data, both historically and also in real time, and the platforms to actually collect those data and make them available for optimization and machine learning. And I think this is really a key enabler because that will allow you to understand your supply chain better, your suppliers, your customers, but also everything in between, finding the pain point, the available capacity that you have. The second driver that I think is really important right now is automation. And that's going to be affecting the entire supply chain as well, from the logistic aspect, but also inside the warehouses, the facilities, and automating the processes as well. And finally, the third one, which is my favorite, obviously, is this convergence between machine learning and optimization. And this ability to actually solve problems of unprecedented scale by merging these two technologies, also solving problems in real time that we were not able to do before, managing risk better. And I think this is a very unique opportunity right now.
So you must have been really excited by the planning.ai announcement.
Absolutely. I think you could see many of the things that I'm saying right now, which are emerging from this conference. And that's what I think is really exciting here.
Thanks, Pascal. Morgan.
Well, thanks, Anne. And like my colleagues here, I'm very excited to be here with you today. Thank you for hanging around. You're the diehards. Appreciate you coming out this afternoon. So I'm a professor, but I also have the privilege of running our center at TCU, the Center for Supply Chain Innovation, which, by the way, is in Fort Worth, not Dallas. Those of you who know Dallas, Fort Worth, it's an important distinction to make. But in any case, so we're all about looking at innovation, different types of innovation, and a lot of my research has been aimed at trying to quantify the value of innovation, which is not easy to do sometimes. But to put the value proposition of investments in supply chain innovation, whether that's process improvements or technology-enabled innovation, in a language and using metrics that CFOs would care about, financial metrics. In terms of what's critical, I'm actually going to shift it a little bit. I was thinking about this a lot more today, and I'm going to go with labor, actually. Everybody knows there's a huge labor problem right now, and there's certainly some short-term demand and supply issues with labor, but I'm actually more concerned about the longer-term impact. So there's a pretty strong wave of retirements going on right now. I think COVID caused a lot of people to kind of rethink their careers and where they are, and so folks are taking retirement packages and retiring early. And I'm just worried about the brain drain that's happening with that. A lot of knowledge is going to be exiting. And in the planning space in particular, even though planning is becoming more of a science, and we're seeing that happening, there's still a lot of art there, and there's a lot of experience matters. And so I'm worried about that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the new folks who are coming in, we have amazing talent. I'm just blown away by the talent I see at TCU and other universities as well. But with the new work habits, a lot more remote work, a lot less interaction, I just don't know if that knowledge transfer across generations of workers is going to happen like it has in the past. So I'm really concerned about that loss of knowledge going forward in the longer term, 5 years, 10 years down the road. I think that's a big issue that supply chain folks need to be thinking about.
Yeah, that's a big one, and certainly we look at all of you to help with that conversation around talent and next generation talent. Let's start off by sort of some of the big picture things. And Pascal, I love the statement that you were quoted with saying that supply chains are moving from being cost-driven just in time to being risk-aware, resilient, and sustainable. Could you comment a little bit on that and sort of what drove to that comment?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of my favorite topics, as you know. So I think what the pandemic has shown us is that supply chains at this point are really a critical asset for society, and I think you need to consider them as such. And we have not been doing that in a sense. So, and typically when I talk about the risk and risk management and the link to cost and efficiency, I like to make an analogy with the electrical power grid. Because the power grid is also one of these critical infrastructure that we have, obviously, otherwise we wouldn't be able to do this. And the key point is that when you look at how the grid is managed, it's not only optimizing cost, minimizing cost, or maximizing profit. It's also at the same time making sure that the system is resilient enough. So you are really co-optimizing cost or profit with the ability to be resilient. And so if a power plant, somewhere in the US is failing, the customers won't see any difference. The system is resilient enough to recover smoothly. And I think what we need to do now is start thinking about supply chain in exactly those terms. Can you make them resilient such that if one of your suppliers or one of your shipper is actually, failing, your supply chain is going to be smoothly recovering from that. So, and the terms that I like, and this is also what people in power system these days like, is risk-aware supply chain. Mm-hmm. It's not the worst case. You don't optimize for the worst case, but you try to take risk into account when you are optimizing.
And Jan, I know you have a lot of thoughts in this area as well, and often take those two comments around profitability, resiliency, risk awareness, and have the conversation to include sustainability as well. And some of the work you've been doing is in this area.
Yeah, I've been just building on some of Pascal's comments. I think there's two types of flexibility we need to build into our supply chains. So the first is, think about your toilet paper and COVID, is that it's within your current network design. It's where you need to be dynamically flexible to respond to upturns and downturns in demand. And then this sort of builds on some of Nada's expertise, because what this is really about is buffer management. Because you know what, we can quantify the degree of variability on the demand side and on the supply side, so we can right-size our buffers. But sometimes we forget that inventory is not our only buffer. Spare manufacturing capacity and time are also buffers. And so actually what we need to do is to optimize those buffers. And we talk about efficiency, but you also need to be effective. And effectiveness is about doing the right thing. And some of my work around supply chain segmentation and how you demand profile is linked to that effectiveness piece, and then that enables you to be efficient. And in that way, your buffer management strategy gives you the resilience. But sometimes, and again in COVID, we perhaps saw this with things like PPE or ventilators, where the demand surge is just so great that, and we're seeing it now actually with semiconductors, the demand surge is just so great that the current network can't cope with it. So actually what you need then is structural flexibility, and you need to be able to adapt your supply chain network design. Now, to be resilient in that case, and I think it's probably what the energy network use, you need to have redundant nodes. Because actually they're the nodes that you can turn on and off should you need to. And unfortunately, I think what we've not necessarily done is invest in those spare nodes, because actually organizations, who wants to pay for that? We've kept wanting to push that cost, and we all know in life, nothing in life comes for free. And we can optimize that trade-off between resilience and the cost, but ultimately, there is a cost to it. Perhaps we can be cooperative. You could share with your competition some of that redundancy and that built-in. It's maybe why we use things like contract manufacturer and different routes. But really, it's very important to understand both structural flexibility and dynamic flexibility. Because if you're effective and efficient, then you will also be, within your current business models, we can talk about new business models later, as sustainable as you can be.
I think, though, as you're thinking about that, information availability can also be one of those trade-offs to consider when you're looking at those buffers. I don't know if any of you have a comment from that perspective.
So I completely agree. I think the fundamental things that you need at the beginning is visibility or transparency. And so and that's an enabler. I mean, it doesn't do anything on its own, but it gives you visibility of your assets, on your logistics, on every part of your operation. So once you have that visibility, and I think that's what you said, Jen, is what you can start thinking about is the multiple ways in which you can build resiliency inside your supply chain. There is not a one thing that you need to do. There are many different ways. And you can think of different business models, different supply chain models, and obviously redundancy is one, but also the ability to actually reorient your supply chains at different points in time. Right. But you need the visibility, on your suppliers, you need the visibility of your customers and how they are changing over time.
So that dynamic or agile network.
Exactly. And you can do things, and I think that's what you said. The fact that you can adapt in real time is extremely important.
And I think, too, it's really important to be able to see the system, the entire picture. And I think we have this tendency to want to point to any one thing and really optimize one narrow aspect. But I think in this case, being able to see this entire system and then be able to toggle from one to the other, depending upon what the need is really critical. And I think one aspect, if I can piggyback on what Morgan had said, that really ties to this. So you've got the technology on top of all this, but you also need to have talent that understands, right? I just actually am on this board. I saw yesterday some numbers for the previous month here in the US. So there were, I believe, something like 6.7 million new hires. However, 6.3 million had left the workforce, and something like 5.3 million had just quit outright and basically just said, we walk away. So we have a really serious talent issue, and it ties to what Pascal is saying, Jen is saying, is that we're losing people that have institutional knowledge. And we really need this to be able to work with the items we have in place.
Well, maybe just continuing on that topic, Nada, you're certainly known for your work around the use of automation and the balance of human engagement. What role does automation play in this sort of talent gap, and certainly as you look at the future of supply chain?
Yeah, it's actually really huge. So I've been actually working in this area for many years, but we've actually done a lot over the last 8 years and continuing to work with companies gather data. And we have the book that came out right pre-COVID. My co-author said our book was a carrot. COVID created a stick to rely on tech. But what we found out in going into company after company after company is companies that actually led in tech, that we saw as leaders, their secret was talent. It was really people. So I think right now where we are today, things are so complicated that there isn't going to be one answer to the problem. We need collective intelligence. And to actually get this, we really need to marry AI with humans, and I think what you guys do is really ingenious. I mean, it's really forward thinking, but that is really the way we move forward. We automate, optimize the things that we can. However, it is extremely important that we have the interface with the human and the need for knowledge and wisdom. And all we have to do is look at how things were with COVID. And I mean, think about it, right? I mean, I remember 2019, right at the end of the year, talking with companies about AI and all these amazing things. And suddenly COVID starts, and nobody knows. We've got all these models, right, that are forecasting. But we don't know, right? We're sort of trying to, toggle. The experts are toggling between Johns Hopkins and WashU, and each model has certain factors they consider, but not all. So you've got the experts, the human experts, right, that are then taking this. So I think that is the way forward, and we have to accept that.
Yeah, just building on that, Nada, we did some surveys in Europe looking at planning capabilities, and it was about 80% of firms actually said that their planning systems had been relatively robust, but it was a similar then amount that said they had to manually intervene. And I think this is the really important thing. It also builds on some work I did with a major oil company that had just set up a spin-off organization. And they had this sort of dilemma where they said, we've got our young planners that come in who are willing to use the system, and they trust the algorithms 100%. And then they're slightly disparaging against the older planners who are a bit more cynical and don't necessarily trust. And you were sort of getting this impression that they were planning to get rid of their experienced planners. And you say, but just look what happens when we did have our toilet roll surge. You needed somebody that could recognize that for a surge, that could then help to readjust the system. And yes, maybe if we have enough toilet roll surges, the algorithms can learn. But it's really how you combine the two together. And actually, we need all the talent that we've got, particularly planning talents. And it's about perhaps using that talent in the right way and combining that. That's the important way forward.
Yes.
Sorry, Pascal.
Yeah, I think this interface between automation and humans is extremely important. I'd like to add 2 points. One of the things that we are seeing is that the way corporations are thinking about their workers now is changing. It's moving from focusing on productivity to focusing on utilization, or how to best utilize the workers. So that's a very interesting paradigm shift that is happening now. And so because of that, you are designing completely new systems on how to actually manage your workforce in a very different way. And the other thing that I think is important is that there are certain tasks that, and I'm building on what you said, that you don't really want to automate. You want to provide very sophisticated decision support system such that you provide insights and then the decision makers can take the right decision. So there are certain things that you want to keep in the realm of actually human decision makers. But you want to give them tools such that they can analyze a lot of different things very quickly.
Yeah, just to add to that, you used the word insight. So Nada and I actually did a study a couple of years ago. We just spoke with a bunch of different executives in different industries around their plans for technology, investments, and digitalization more broadly. And we were trying to just make sense of it all, just try to simplify the overall phenomenon, I guess. And it really boils down to automation and insight, those two dimensions, right? There's all the kind of classic benefits of automation, but if you focus on just that and ignore the insight aspect or the insight benefits that come from some of the same technologies that provide automation also provide that insight. So it's really a matter of strategically capturing the benefits of both of those dimensions. I'm using this because we actually have a 2x2 matrix.
Right.
Of course, you have to have a 2x2 matrix, but yeah, you can look at a lot of different investment decisions as how they fit into that overall matrix and where the true capabilities lie. So I think it's a great way to look at those kinds of decisions.
Agreed.
Now, when we think about that future supply chain, I know, Morgan, you've also spoken about the need for new supply chain metrics.
Yeah.
And I think there can be many different types, different ways of quantifying impact, but I know of particular interest to you is that relationship between the supply chain and the office of the CFO. Can you talk a little bit about the criticality of that competence, understanding the financial metrics for future supply chain leaders?
Yeah. Well, as I've learned more and more about working with my finance and accounting colleagues and just interfacing with CFOs out there, I've learned a little bit more about their world. And as most of you probably know, CFOs are confronted with lots of options in terms of how they use the capital that they have at their disposal. And they can spend it on R&D, you can spend it on brand building, you can try to grow the business, capture market share, or you can do what they really like to do, put it in the stock market or some kind of other fancy investment to make money. So the supply chain, I think to be effective, supply chain executives have to be able to offer competing value propositions with those other alternative uses. And the kind of traditional or conventional approach has been, all right, well, let's automate to reduce labor, and that's an immediate cost savings, kind of classic capital for labor substitution. That's been our bread and butter for many years, and we've tended to focus on what I would call first order capabilities, things like productivity you mentioned, or efficiency, or cost savings of other types. And those kinds of outcomes are usually very visible, they're immediate, the cause and effect relationship is clear. But kind of building on what you guys were talking about with resilience, what we need is a second layer or higher order level of capabilities to be able to justify investments in those. And I'm talking about resilience or agility or flexibility. And I like to put all of those underneath this idea of options, creating options. So can we make investments that not only provide these short-term predictable benefits, but also create options that help us deal with risk, right? And the reason I like to use that options framework is that CFOs are used to thinking about options in the stock market, right? You can buy and sell options to buy and sell stock. And I think we can, and there's plenty of research out there that looks at real options in the same way. So this is just one avenue that I've been thinking about a lot lately. If we could reposition investments, again, in process improvements or technology enablement or training programs or whatever, as not only just affecting those first order outcomes, but the second order outcomes too, either in terms of an insurance model or an options model, so that we look at investments today and how they create opportunities for options in the future, ability to scale faster, to switch faster, to build in those underlying capabilities that give us more flexibility to respond to disruptions or other kinds of risks.
Yep, so that's a really important aspect of this sort of structural flexibility type of argument. And it's about building in, I suppose, it's about economies of scope quite often and not economies of scale. So in Europe, Britvic, actually, they made a huge investment in automation. Previously in Europe, each plant produced one drink. I don't know if you know the sort of Fanta, Sprite, I might not get them quite right. But they made this huge investment about 5 years ago where every plant could produce every product. Because what that gave them then is ultimate scalability. So if you were to look at the return on investment for that in a conventional way, it wouldn't pay off. Right. They needed to look at it in a sort of real option type of way. And if you then think COVID came along, but they were then fully resilient because they had within each country a plant that could produce all products. And I think thinking about economies of scope rather than scale is going to be a major consideration for our supply chains as we move forward. But it's linked to a very different way of looking at investments, which I would fully concur with Morgan, is really linked to looking at real option value.
And I have to say, I think it's a really big leap for us because we're sort of used to thinking in one kind of a way. Yes. We have to change our language and we have to really understand what matters to CFOs, to CEOs, and be able to meet them where they play, if you will. And we can't stay in our own little box. So I think it's about risk, it's about managing it, assessing it, and having different metrics and ways to be able to do that in a way that they understand.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that. So my NSF program director for the Institute, when we proposed a strategic plan, she said, you have to define metrics of resilience. You have to define stress tests like every other engineering discipline. Yeah. You have to get inspired by what they do in financial engineering. You have to be inspired by what they do in power system. For instance, they measure how many times you lose power in a year. And even that industry, which has all these metrics, is actually trying to incorporate many more concepts from financial engineering and how they can mitigate risk and the metrics to actually make sure that they meet the targets in mitigating. So I think between what everyone is saying here, there are a lot of different facets to this particular issue.
But if I can add, so it seems obvious, right? But I think the biggest challenge is for us to really think differently. And I don't think that, I think people still, a lot of business people that I talk with, they still somehow think that 2019 is coming back. 2018 is coming back. And I want to say, folks, it's not. It's over. We are in an uncharted territory and we have to really think differently. And all of this is, we can do all this with software, with AI, with tech, and humans and talent, but we have to see things and think in a very different way. Mm-hmm.
Now, not just on that, I know one of your topics that's close to your heart is around silos and really silo busting.
And you know that.
I do, which is why I knew this is a good topic for you. When we talk about the office of the CFO versus the chief supply chain officer, quite often they are very siloed organizations. So what are some of the things that we need to do to ensure that we're actually eliminating those silos so we can think differently?
Kinaxis, the software. No, I'm serious, and I'm a huge fan, you know that. And those of you that know me know this is really a pet peeve of mine. It was when I was very young, in my PhD program, and I would see that these silos existed, and marketing people did their own thing, and incentives in terms of sales, and then you look at operations, and it's inventory. And I remember at the time, and I was very young, and I would think, this is just not smart business. Well, now you fast forward, and we haven't made any headway. And these silos have to be broken down. We have to look at processes. We have to look at business processes, and within that process have throughput and flow. And really, algorithms, software is really key. And yes, I'm kidding, but it's true. What you guys are doing is amazing. And one of the things that, in our book, Hugh Machine, we talk about is super intelligent enterprise and pathways to it. And Kinaxis is really one of those possible pathways, because what you're doing is you're actually breaking those silos down, and you're transparent, and having really kind of one unified flow is absolutely essential.
Yeah, if I could jump in there. Actually, I think the picture you painted with the CS Chief Supply Chain Officer and the CFO is kind of the best case scenario. There's still a ton of companies that don't have a centralized supply chain umbrella organization. One of my colleagues at TCU, actually my former doctoral student when I was back at Michigan State, this is his whole thing, organizational design and supply chain functions. We've done some research, and it's still a majority of companies that have, logistics is reporting up through sales or some other organization. Purchasing is maybe reporting to the CFO, or maybe depending on where they are. It's all over the map. And then the COO is something completely different, and internal manufacturing somewhere else. So I think a first step that a lot of companies have taken, but I see more and more, is this establishment of a corporate level supply chain office, right? Especially in these multi-divisional firms, whether it's a center of excellence or a corporate supply chain office with a CSCO title. That's a first step, and then that gives the function some ability and clout to start to negotiate with some of the other C-level folks. But for a lot of companies, they're not even close to that yet. So we've got to get a long way to go.
So let me pitch in from a technology standpoint. So I think one of the things when you see platforms like, that Kinaxis is building, that other people are building, what you see is that these platforms are kind of digital twins of the real world. And once you start doing that, that can be good for operation, technical planning, or long-term planning, but they can also be very, they provide a platform for also strategic thinking and exploring, both from a financial and operation standpoint, what these supply chains are really doing. And I think that can be the link between a CFO and a supply chain manager. Because now you can play scenarios, you can play games, you can actually see what would happen under various scenarios, what you can do for mitigating risk, what you can do for improving efficiency. I think the value of these digital twins is actually amazing. And what we found is that it's the right way of actually people to, it gives you a way to talk about the same issues from different angles.
Yeah, interesting. And maybe just a continuation on that. I know one of the topics, Pascal, you've been talking about a little bit is the stress test, and you mentioned it a little while ago, but how important it is once you have that digital twin to be able to stress test it as a way to de-risk not only your supply chain, but really your whole business. Did you want to share a little bit of your thoughts around this stress testing?
Yeah, this is a topic we spend a lot of time thinking, and I think it's probably going to resonate with Nada, but because it's kind of where you integrate optimization and forecasting and then, risk management. And so what we find very useful is to actually not only do forecasts or point forecasts like most people still do, but really start doing uncertainty quantification, scenario generation, and then trying to use what we call these days, risk-aware optimization to try to find out what's the right trade-off between efficiency and risk mitigation. But it's all about this journey from forecasting to uncertainty quantifications, and then looking at the effect in the downstream optimization process, because we were talking about siloed before, and the forecasting community and the optimization community have been siloed for generation. Yeah. And what you have now is an opportunity to actually merge them and align the various objectives, because typically, the forecasting people will optimize this, ignoring what are the downstream processes. And the people, in optimization are going to take these, upstream forecasts without actually trying to see what they mean. And so I think now is the time to unify the two disciplines, and that's one of the things I'm really excited about.
So Pascal, I would fully concur, but actually sometimes the issue is humans. Coming back to, and KPIs, something that Morgan was mentioning. So I think one of the issues that's driven a lot of silo thinking within organizations is smart targets. So if you think about it at the C-suite, the business measures are very generic. They'll be about return on capital employed, profitability. They're big level numbers and they're not smart. You can't absolutely say and pin down one individual and say you're responsible for all of that. As we cascade down through our functions, we give people smart targets. You actually encourage people to only take targets that are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. And then by their very nature, they're siloed. So actually, if we're truly going to start thinking end-to-end and start building business processes, we have to change the way that we actually look at our metrics. And maybe this is where the digital twist, and maybe we have to change our mindset to actually think about that we don't actually have, I mean, I think perhaps the balance is business-facing measures, customer-facing measures, and you still want some functional expertise. You know, you want planners to be really good planners or people in production to be really good at production. But I think this is that man-machine or human-person-machine interface piece, which we can have all the digital twins in the world, but if we're still giving people their bonus based on how well they're performing in their own function, we'll always be fighting the system.
So, yeah, let me build on this, because this is not just for these digital twins and the strategic thinking, it's also about how operations are typically managed. Exactly. So I worked a lot in port logistics, and what you see the way this is done is really sequentialized. You deal with the key site, and then you optimize the link between the key site and the rail, and then you optimize the yard. And so those things are completely separated in general. And you can solve these very well, but then you don't see the downstream effect. And so I think what you see now, and we saw that at this conference as well, is look at the global effects of every one of these optimization. And the benefit should be the recognition of what you do for the entire end-to-end optimization, not every one of these processes. And so I completely agree. That's on the operations side, but you want to do that at a strategic level as well. I completely agree with what you said.
Yeah, because what you end up is this, optimizing individual silos. You haven't optimized the system as a whole.
And the individuals are fighting the system, and especially, I mean, many organizations now are setting up global planning hubs, which is just the way to go. It's the sort of intelligent brain, because planning is the glue that holds the whole supply chain together, but you need to then sort of untether it from then those functional targets or silo targets to enable it to truly deliver that end-to-end vision.
And you have to really, when it comes to the KPIs, and really using clever, well-thought-out metrics is really important. So on the forecasting side, I always found it interesting that forecasters will measure in the typical metrics, mean square error, MAPE, you name it, MAD, and so forth. But then you ask them, well, what does this mean in terms of cost? Okay, so my MSE is X. We know, if you understand the business, you understand that it doesn't translate one-to-one. So 1% up or down in an MPE doesn't translate when I consider batching, setup time, setup costs, lead times, all of it. And so really being able to use metrics that incorporate and account for that and look into, and then ultimately look at dollars or other areas, I think, is really important.
Sort of going back to that second order that Morgan spoke to earlier around understanding your agility, your flexibility, your productivity, and how do you capture
it doesn't
those
translate one-on-one,
right.
And I think each silo assumes that it does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. Well, while we're thinking about this end-to-end, I'd be remiss not to talk about the circular economy, because that's a really hot topic right now as well, and I know, Jan, that's certainly one of your areas of expertise. How critical is it for supply chain leaders to engage in the conversation and action on sustainability and the circular economy, and what do they need to consider?
So I obviously come from Europe. I'm based in the UK, and we've got some really ambitious targets around net zero by 2050. And there's two sort of elements to that. One is around industrial decarbonisation. So that's essentially for every factory or lorry or node that you have that you try to decarbonise it, so using low carbon energy and the likes. But the reality is the current way that we do things, you know, the take, make, dump approach, has really is underpinned by what we see as consumption-driven economic growth. And that has driven every stage of our industrial evolution up until this point. You know, it's why Ford ultimately designed the production line, because he wanted to make cars cheap enough that everyone could buy. It's also why he introduced the living wage, so his employees could afford to buy them too. And we talk very much about Industry 4 in this next stage of our industrial evolution, but it's not really about technology, because technology has evolved all over those 200 years. What's really different now is that we cannot continue to pursue consumption-driven economic growth, because we're recognizing the impact it has not just on the environment, but also on society. We've got very inequitable supply chains. I think some of you, especially if you've got a large retailer or an OEM as your customer, may feel some of that inequity yourselves. And so what we need to do going forward is find new business models that essentially decouple consumption from production and enable companies to still thrive in a way where they're more resource efficient, are better for the planet, better for society, and have different economic models. And the way to do that is to keep things in their highest possible value state for as long as possible, and to pursue those principles of the circular economy where we seek to repair, refurbish, reuse, and actually we only recycle as an absolute last resort. And really good organizations have started to do this. Look at HP. You used to be able to just buy ink cartridges to stick in your printer. You still can. But in a way, I say you're foolish if you still do, because it's costing you more money and you're not getting such good service. Because if you subscribe to a system like Instant Ink, enabled just by a tiny bit of connectivity to your internet, then essentially for a much smaller amount of money each month, you can print what you like, you never run out of ink. And HP know exactly what you've used. It's also magic ink. Those cartridges are bigger. And you're much more likely to recycle them because they send you out the bag. And that's a system that's a win-win-win. It's a win for HP, and it's a win for you as a consumer. And they're the types of business models that are going to win in the future. And I challenge you to think about how much is your organization really thinking about the business models that are going to sustain you in the future? Are you really embracing those principles of the circular economy?
Yeah, I'll just add, I'm really encouraged actually by the growth of servitization of that business model. That's an example that Jan just gave in HP. I think it's been around for a long time in major industrial products, aircraft and trains and planes and all those kinds of things. But we're starting to see that filter down, and it's really exciting because it not only helps the environment and builds a circular economy, but it creates another opportunity for supply chain to contribute to the top line, not just be a bottom line, but to be a revenue and a growth driver through supply chain capabilities. So I think it's a really great opportunity for the future.
That's a really good point, because at the moment, many manufacturers see it's a sort of, not quite a race to the bottom, but they're seeing their margins being squeezed. It's very difficult to have growth. Yep. And so this gives you new business models that are value creating, and actually new jobs in the supply chain, because it's not just those forward-looking jobs, it's the jobs around the repair and the remanufacture and so on and so forth. I think that's a really good point, Morgan.
So how can we ensure that supply chain leaders are engaging in those conversations? Because we're seeing, again, the decoupling of that, sustained circular economy sustainability objectives are happening outside of the conversation with the chief supply chain officer. Are there ways, are there things that planners and others can do when it comes to understanding their own, carbon footprint, their own sustainability objectives?
So in the UK, we've got a research project actually funded by the UK government where we're looking, and I know that you've got similar initiatives yourself, where we're looking to develop an end-to-end supply chain optimization platform that doesn't just optimize on cost, quality, and time. And this is multi-echelon. This particular one looks at a large yellow goods provider who needs wheels, and then a company that makes wheels, and then a company that makes steel. And essentially what it does, rather than just looking to try to optimize based on cost, it actually introduces carbon, because if you think about many supply chains, procurement functions can be a little bit adversarial. And so we start to see some tensions and lack of trust and people not wanting to share. But let's think, if we introduce carbon as that neutral language, and we now have supply chains trying to work together collaboratively to minimize the carbon end to end, then carbon can become that language of trust. And that's what we're trying out.
You could track it, quantify it, which is really important. I think when you can quantify something, you can then track it and be able to talk about the one item.
So I like the fact that Jan talked about the new business model, because this is one of the things that is happening. And once you do that, there are synergies between the new business models, automation, and then sustainability. So I think one of the things that you will see is that some of the new transportation model, because they're very different, will actually favor electrification, for instance. The fact that you use AI and optimization allows you also to understand your customers better and to actually target essentially what you are building to your customers in a much better fashion. So I think you can see how technology actually sometimes has really very nice synergies with sustainability. And once people are starting thinking about this, you see opportunities where you believe there were none. And I think that's a very interesting aspect that I didn't realize at first, but this is one of the things we can leverage as well.
I think also to actually influence the market. I mean, ultimately, we can manage what the perception is and what appeals. And I think more and more, I think Henry Ford, Steve Jobs, when they said about not knowing what customers want, I think is really true. I think if you ask them what they want everything. And I think on that end, we're actually seeing where we are able to place people in a group and actually watch how they use products and then be able to offer and sell to them, if you will, in terms of what they ultimately want, even though they can't express what they want. And I think that's going to be a very important part.
I think that's so important. Every single one of us in this room is a consumer.
Absolutely.
How many of us make the most sustainable or responsible choice? Does every one of us, when we go to a supermarket, for instance, always pick up the fair trade coffee? I did want to do some research on the role of shame, that if, every time someone went to a shelf and they picked up the unsustainable one, like a big klaxon, like a siren went off, would that encourage people to make the more sustainable choice? Or so you don't want to get involved in my research projects, but maybe you can go back to your organizations and try to sell to them or just remind them of the United Nations Sustainability Development Goal 12, which is responsible consumption and production. And I think going forward, we have to think about the consumer and how we can nudge the consumer to make the right choice, because ultimately it's that consumer demand that drives our entire supply chain. So how do we make consumers make the more not just sustainable, but also responsible choice, because we want to build this in for society too, to then drive the right supply chain behavior end to end.
Yeah. Yes, and they don't know in so many cases. We assume, and we're kind of working in our own bubble in terms of making it happen, but we haven't really educated that end. So I think that is a really, really important part of it.
I want to add just an adjacent comment, I guess, but as I was listening to this, I was thinking about back to the talent issue. And there's so much competition for good talent, of course, today. And I think about our students, and of course, we're trying to get more and more students to study supply chain. We have 5 or 6 jobs for every student, and it's the same at all universities. And so we talk to them about supply chain and careers, and hey, you can help companies make more money. That just doesn't turn them on. But if you start to talk about sustainability, how supply chain affects the environment, how it affects the social well-being of people around the world, then their eyes light up, So if you're a company that can tell that story and you can demonstrate that you actually care about that and it's part of your supply chain strategy and it's part of your DNA, I mean, you're going to get some of the better people to be interested in jobs at your organization.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true.
Absolutely.
In our prep call for this meeting, you all mentioned something about the changing structure of business, the changing structure of work post-pandemic, whether it was around this sort of never again mentality or just in time versus just in case, which I know sort of sets us a little bit on fire. Pascal, you also talked about the emergence of micro-fulfillment centers and things like that. I was wondering maybe if you could make a comment on the changing face of work.
So I think from my standpoint, so e-commerce before the pandemic started, changing a little bit the business models, but the pandemic has just, accelerated everything, and so you see. I mean, most people didn't know about this. Obviously, they don't know about these micro-fulfillment centers. They don't know about these dark stores. All this seems to be kind of, magical or, scary. But essentially, these are business models that are adapting to the needs of or the expectations of the customers. And they try to, but at the same time, they create new business models that are more agile, that are more flexible. And so I think this is the changing nature of supply chains. They are very different. And I don't know if the answer of today are going to be the answer of tomorrow, but I like to quote one of my colleagues, which is always saying that in supply chain, the question is always the same, but the answer is different all the time, and it's continuously changing. And I think what you are seeing now is because of changing customers' expectation, because of the demands and how the supply chains are stressed, you see different business models that are emerging, but they have also a lot of benefits in addition to the fact that they meet the current demand of the customers better. And so these micro-fulfillment centers, these dark stores, are all about trying to efficiently and in a resilient fashion address the needs of the customers.
Nada, you look like you have a comment.
You could tell. So I think what I worry about is I take issue with the fact that we point always to one problem and say that is the cause. JIT has been the scapegoat for so much of it. So what I'm seeing right now, I don't know if it's a backlash, but I am seeing a lot of companies that are just simply storing or buying lots of inventory. We just did a survey in 2 weeks ago, and we actually found almost everybody was saying they were just buying as much as they possibly could. I think those are really very quick, short-sighted answers to it, and I don't think that that's going to work in the long run. I don't think that just throwing JIT out the window is a smart thing. I think AI comes into play here that can really help us be surgical in terms of our products and how we buy, and I think what we're going to move to is these really caveats to JIT, where maybe in some cases we do have a little bit more inventory, but not across the board. What I am worried about is that we're moving into this model where we're panicking and we're just going to buy what we can. That's not the answer.
Right.
Yeah. So just to add to that, so I have another project going on now that's looking at working capital and how people are using working capital. And we're seeing the same thing. If you look across manufacturing sectors, compared to 2019, the average inventory level is about 20 to 25% more than 2019. Cash is almost double in some industry sectors. So everybody's hedging through buffer, right? And that's an important part of an overall risk management strategy, but it shouldn't be the only tool in the toolkit or whatever. And to your point, we're just hoping that smart supply chain folks will look at the overall system and say it's not one size fits all. It's not an extra layer of safety stock across the board. No, it's risk management. It's identifying which of these products, which of the suppliers, which of the regions of the world, how are they differentiated in terms of risk, and then let's come up with a hybrid solution that uses buffers, but also options and other kinds of flexibilities to best address the risks of the specific sectors. It's complicated and it takes a lot of work and time, but in the end, it's going to be a lot more effective and efficient.
And this is where AI comes in and really helps in terms of process and kind of pare it down.
I think it's a combination of business model, infrastructure, technology together. Because I think obviously just buying inventory is not going to be reasonable in any sense. But what you can do is consolidate different inventories in different parts and have a much more agile model in actually when you are actually supply the demand at different places.
And so where you place them.
Exactly, and where you place it and what is the most effective way to actually move things around so that you meet the needs. And this is the kind of things that technology can help you with, recognizing some of these trends and then optimizing automatically. So it's just not buying more investment. That would be the radical option, but it's all restructuring your supply chain so that you can be more agile and address the shortages by using surpluses elsewhere.
So I think ultimately it goes down to the basics of good supply chain management that sometimes we forget about. And talking about buffers, inventory is not the only buffer. Spare manufacturing capacity or capacity is also a really good buffer. People can be a buffer. And I agree it needs optimizing across the network, but let me tell you a story. I did some work. I've been working for about 8 years, 10 years with Tata Consumer Products. You might recognize them for Tetley Tea in the UK, or I think it's 6 o'clock coffee in the US.
Yes, 8 o'clock.
8 o'clock, I don't know. But they had a really quite forward-thinking ops director who's worked with us for around 8 years, looking at initially just around supply chain segmentation. This is the idea that different products have different demand profiles. We did a lot of work to look at the strategy around that, and initially it just linked to inventory. And then we recognized that manufacturing could be a buffer too. And right the way back from my pharma days, people strive for demonstrated capacity of 85%, and you can get that if you're producing a limited range of products at very high volume. But the minute you start having to deal with variability, really, really decent OEE at that sort of stage or demonstrated capacity is much likely to be much closer to 55, 60%. And so what he asked us to do is to start thinking about how we traded off for his organization, where he had fully depreciated assets. These are old tea packing lines, how we could trade off the right inventory and manufacturing buffer. And the real reason he wanted to do it, because he knew at some point in the future, coming back to real option value, he was going to have to make an investment in new kit. And what he didn't want to do is for the finance people to base this investment on a really high level of demonstrated capacity. When he knew if he wanted to meet his customers' high-low promotional strategy, he needed that spare demonstrated capacity to be able to respond. Anyway, we set all this up and he sat pretty, really waiting to see at the point in the future he needs to invest in his kit, and COVID hit. At that time, Tetley were third in the market in the UK for tea. When COVID hit, they moved from third in the market to first in the market, demonstrated by Nielsen data. And that is because their buffer management strategy, and it was not inventory, enabled them to respond to that upturn in demand. And subsequently, having demonstrated how well they responded to COVID, he's managed to make the case to the board for the capital investment in the new manufacturing kit. So I think it's really important, as you say, we take this holistic view. Definitely do not throw JIT out the window. You need to use some of Nada's amazing skills and really think about demand profiles for individual products, and use the machine learning or AI to then help you work out the right strategy. But do not forget about the power of capacity as a buffer too.
Great. Well, we only have a couple minutes left. So as we wrap up, I'd like for each of you to say, what is that one piece of advice you'd like our audience to take away as they look towards their future supply chain? So maybe Morgan, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, it's an exciting time to be in supply chain. I feel so blessed to be where I am, and I hope you feel that way too, although I think your worlds are probably a little more complex and uncertain than mine is. But I guess my takeaway is just to consider that complexity and uncertainty, those create opportunities for advantage, right? So if there's complexity and uncertainty out there, try to embrace it and look for ways to establish differential advantage through managing that complexity and uncertainty. I think there's great potential there.
Thanks, Morgan. Pascal.
Yeah, I completely agree that this is a fantastic time to be in supply chains, and I think my advice would be that this is the right time to innovate. It's the right time to innovate from a business standpoint, from a supply chain organization standpoint, and then from a technology standpoint. I think, I want to come back to my first remark that we live in a world that is going to be driven by data. And once you have these platforms, once you have the right tools, the machine learning, the optimization tools, you can start evaluating all the options that you have, all the business models that you have, and start innovating in a fundamental fashion. And this is the right time to do it. Yeah.
Thanks, Nada.
What I would say is, with all of this, do not forget about people, about talent. People are complex. We're emotional. We have many needs. You want to hire the best people, but you want to keep the best people. I've looked at data right now, and I think we've heard this too. It's not just about money. It's about terms. It's about a whole host of things, about belonging, culture. One of the things that I could say is you can't fake it. So treat your people well, and all levels. And don't forget about the gray hairs that have the wisdom. Don't throw them away. Cultivate talent.
Thanks, Jen.
So we used to say that you should really design your products, your processes, and your supply chains concurrently, this idea of 3D concurrent engineering. But what I would say is, and we've not always been so great at doing our supply chains concurrently, though I'm sure all of you in this room have. But we need to move beyond that now. We need to think of designing our products, our processes, and our supply chains concurrently, but for the circular economy. So it's not just about concurrent engineering or CE, it's about CE squared, concurrent engineering in a circular economy.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining me today, Jen, Nada, Pascal, Morgan. This was a fantastic conversation, and I hope you'll all join me in saying thank you to my esteemed panel.